Genesis chapter 49. So Joseph, at this point, he had brought his two sons to his father Jacob after he got the word that he was indeed very sick. And he knows that his father was very old and very fragile at this point. He was unable to walk, his eyes were dim, and any sickness at this point of his life could take it. So Joseph, he made his way with his two boys, Manasseh and Ephraim, to his father. And Joseph goes before him. And Jacob began to share with Joseph his encounter with God at Luz, or Bethel, and shared the promise, word for word, that God had given to him. And he looks at Joseph and says, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact, God has not only shown him Joseph's face, but also his offspring's. Joseph wanted his father to bless his boys. And the first thing Jacob informs Joseph are that the boys, Manasseh and Ephraim, are his. And any other son that Joseph had afterwards, okay, those are yours. And that Manasseh and Ephraim would be called by the name of their brothers in the inheritance. So they were elevated as the first brothers, right? Then Joseph placed his sons in a position so that Jacob could bless them. He put his oldest son Manasseh under Jacob's right hand and the youngest Ephraim under his left hand. And Jacob began to bless Joseph. But when he began to bless the boys, he did the old switcheroony, where he put his right hand on Ephraim's head, the youngest, and the left hand on Manasseh's head. And Joseph tried to move the hands, if you remember last week, to correct the situation. And this kind of upset Joseph. And he tried to let his father know respectively and said to him, not so, father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But Jacob refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He knew the will of God in this and did so in confidence, that Manasseh will become a people, but the younger Ephraim shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. And so Jacob blessed them, and then he says to Joseph, behold, I am dying. And he says, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. And we pick things up in Genesis chapter 49, verse 1. And Jacob called his sons and said, gather together that I might tell you what shall befall you in the last days. Gather together and hear, you sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. So we're at the final words of Jacob. He's on his deathbed and calls his sons to him. And now he's going to prophesy over them by the Holy Spirit. And keep in mind, these are the final words that these boys are going to hear from their dad. Now, verse 1, Jacob tells them he's going to tell them what is going to happen, as in what God will do with them in the future, which Jacob intends these words to be a blessing according to verse 21. But not all the brothers' futures are going to be very bright. So not all of them brought shades with them, because the future's so bright. There are some hard truths that Jacob will share with them that he's going to say. And Jacob, their father, he's not going to hold back or soften the truth. Even though these will be hard for them to hear, make no mistake, in the midst of it, the hard truth from God is a blessing, even if it comes as a warning. It is a blessing to know the truth in order to make changes in your lives that's needed. Because how could you truly know if it's not being told to you, right? So I would rather know the truth, even if it hurts. So God, through Jacob, blesses them with the knowledge of what is to come. And he begins with Reuben, the firstborn. Verse 3 says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. So Jacob describes Reuben as he was the firstborn of Jacob, his first boy. And all that was within his creative power went into Reuben, which in the ancient culture, this is how they viewed the firstborns. And being that the firstborns, they come with the birthright and the blessing. And Jacob is telling Reuben, you had everything right there in front of you, given to you to succeed. You had every opportunity that anyone could ever need to forge your own history for our people and God's purpose for our family. Reuben, you had all this that no one else had. But then Jacob says to Reuben in verse 4, unstable as water, you shall not excel. Because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Reuben, he had it all, but it all collapsed. When he sinned against his father and defiled his father's bed, Reuben commits adultery with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. And Jacob says to him that you shall not excel concerning Reuben's future. Why? Because he was as unstable as water. Reuben's instability by his sin, it divided the birthright. Usually the firstborn would become the spiritual leader of the family. And Reuben was the firstborn among the sons of Israel, giving him the birthright among the sons of Israel. The blessing as well, the priesthood to be the leader of the family who would rule with authority. But by his sin, all that was divided to the brothers instead of being centralized with the firstborn. Now, some say that when Reuben went into his father's concubine, that it was a power move to take over the family, to become the leader of the family. The problem with that idea is that he was the firstborn. He already had the birthright and the blessing, already receiving the double portion. He didn't need to do that. It was already in front of him. But this was a clear character flaw of Reuben. He made a decision out of impulse without thinking of the consequences, and it defiled his father's bed. That was no small impulse. This was a choice that did a lot of damage, that caused a lot of pain. This was a high price that he paid for instability. And what would be for Reuben's future? It says the tribe of Reuben did not excel, just as Jacob prophesied. Not one prophet, not one judge, nor king ever came from the tribe of Reuben. In the time of Judges, in chapter 5, verses 15 through 16, when the tribes were rendering aid to Deborah and Issachar, in a time of battle, the tribe of Reuben, they hesitated. They took no action. They weren't willing to make a decision. Thus, the tribe of Reuben was characterized by irresolution. And Jacob was pointing out Reuben's character, his flaws, by the sin that he did. It was this that revealed the lack of character. And Jacob lets him know, Reuben, you will not excel. You are unstable as water, because he couldn't keep his sexual desires in check. And it cost him everything as the firstborn son. Now, what's interesting about water, him using that reference as water, being unstable, is that water always flows or follows its own will. And water also gravitates to its lowest point. It won't stop going lower and lower and lower until it reaches its lowest point. And this is the picture of Reuben morally. He allowed the sinful desire of his flesh and all its lust to run wild wherever it wanted to, just like the water. And he didn't control it or put it in check, but instead, he let it lead him down the lowest point. It led him to sin in the lowest possible way you can possibly think of, too. This was huge by disrespecting his father and defiling his bed. Jacob recognized that this was more than just a mistake that Reuben made, but a character flaw, because consciously, Reuben had to ignore many stop signs that went against his conscience. Moral stop sign, a cultural stop sign, a family stop sign, and my goodness, his father. If anything, that would have been a huge stop sign. With all these things, Jacob recognized and said, you shall not excel, because no one who is unstable as water cannot control their appetites will ever excel for the kingdom of God. Then Jacob calls on, verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Verse 6, let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So as Jacob spoke to Reuben concerning his lack of sexual control, now he rebukes Simeon and Levi for their anger and their wrath. And this came from earlier in Genesis chapter 34, verses 25 through 29, when they slaughtered all the men of Shechem for the rape of their sister Dinah by one man, Shechem, the son of Hamor. And they used circumcision as an agreement for the tribes to come together, but used the vulnerability of the third day when the guys were healing on the worst day of circumcision, the third day. They came into their city when they were the weakest on the third night, and they slayed Hamor and his son Shechem and all the men of the city. This was barbaric and cold-blooded murder. And Jacob was like, you have troubled me by making me and my name obnoxious, as in the stink among all the inhabitants. And these sons responded, should we treat our sister like a harlot? Now, I don't want to get too in depth with that whole situation of what happened in that chapter, but Jacob saw their wrath and their anger, that it went beyond justice. It was cold-blooded murder of all the men for one man's crime. It was fierce and cruel. But Jacob at that time, he didn't rebuke him, if you remember. He was only concerned about himself and his family, because there were a small number of people. And they're like, you're going to have all these cities chasing us, and they're going to slaughter all of us. But he rebukes them now on his deathbed. And not only does he rebuke them, but he distances himself from them and went on the record that he has nothing to do with them, or that he never condoned it nor endorsed that slaying that his sons did. And because of what they did, verse 7, he says he will scatter them in Israel. And what's interesting prophetically is that Jacob's word proved true. God did both divide the tribes and scatter them among Israel, but it happened differently for each tribe. Simeon's tribe was sort of absorbed into the tribal area of Judah for their lack of faithfulness, and they were virtually dissolved as a tribe. Levi's tribe was scattered throughout the land, but as a blessing for their faithfulness during the rebellion of the golden calf. And God scattered the Levites in 48 cities as a blessing. So you have both tribes that are scattered out, one a blessing and the other a curse, all in fulfillment of what Jacob has just prophesied here. And I believe that because of their wrath and their anger was so fierce, so cruel, so dark, to the point of cold-blood murder, they were scattered out, so their influence would not be centralized as one people within the nation of Israel. So I believe that for my personnel, I believe that he scattered them out for that reason. Verse 8, it says, Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise, and the name of Judah means praise. He says, your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, speaking they will have victory over their enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. So meaning he would be now the preeminent tribe among his brothers. You would think it would be Joseph, but it isn't. Judah would be the tribe that surpasses the brothers. But we know Judah wasn't exactly a great example either to follow. First, he suggested to sell Joseph off for 20 pieces of silver. That was him. Second, he also did not deal with Tamar faithfully, with dealing with his two sons. She was the widow. Remember, she married the first son. He died because he was evil in the sight of God. Second one marries her. He dies because he was doing some wonky things to prevent himself from getting her a child. And so he died. But yet he didn't want to give his youngest child to her. So he kind of made her wait. But yet, as he kept blowing her off, he goes up and has sex with her as she's disguised as a prostitute in Genesis chapter 38. Not to mention, she was a Gentile. So that whole situation was a mess. However, later, he would intercede and would be willing to sacrifice himself as a substitute to Benjamin, his brothers, and for his father for their freedom when he was dealing with Joseph. He didn't know it was Joseph at that point. He thought it was just Pharaoh's right-hand man. But that was an ultimate sacrifice that he was willing to do. So overall, this blessing is what superseded his mistakes. And his actions became an example of the richness of God's grace. And I love that. And then Jacob says in verse 9, Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him? Now, if I were you, I would circle the word lion in your Bibles or in your mind. Now, in regards to the animal planet and the animal kingdom, what is the lion? Exactly. He's the king of the land, majesty. Verse 10, and the scepter, and what is a scepter? It's a staff. Exactly, authority. It's a staff with an ornamental head used for royal authority. It's a symbol of kingship. They use it to issue decrees and so forth and stuff like that. So only to be used by the one who governs on the throne. He says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver. Who's the lawgiver? The king in ancient times. Nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. That's key. And what Jacob is prophesying here is that Judah will be the tribe who will supply the nation of Israel with their kings. King David, the greatest king of Israel, came from the tribe of Judah. And many other kings came through the bloodline, but the greatest king that came from the tribe of Judah, while also supplying many kings, until Shiloh comes, which both Christians and Jews acknowledge the word Shiloh as the meaning of the Messiah, until he comes. And this Messiah king would come from the bloodline of King David, born in Bethlehem, we all know to be Jesus Christ. So Jacob prophesied that the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah right here. And in verse 11, he also, and this coming verse, starts to prophesy concerning the millennial age where Jesus, our King, will rule. Verse 11 says, binding his donkey to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. Now, in the current age, you would never tie a donkey to a vine. That's just, you wouldn't do it back then, and you more likely won't do it now. Because the vines, they're extremely valuable. They're too valuable. You don't want him yanking the vine. We all know that the vine is the most important part of the whole vine itself, that whole area where all the branches, where all the fruit gets all its nutrients. You would never, ever tie a colt or a donkey to that. But this speaks of an age here where the vines will be unrestrained with abundance. In other words, for Judah, grapevines will be so abundant that they will be used for hitching posts to the choice of vines. Now, we're talking about the 1,000-year reign. Okay, during that time frame where Jesus is ruling, there's going to be abundance of vines, abundance of all this stuff. Look, and he washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of the grapes. So there's so much of an abundance of wine, you could almost view wine as wash water. There will be so much fruit. Verse 12, his eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. So in Judah, the people's eyes will be red because there will be an overabundance of wine and the white from the abundance of milk. All right, so the millennial reign is described with a supernatural abundance of fruit and good health, and apparently extremely, extremely good hygiene, dental hygiene. Teeth whiter than milk. I mean, come on. Come on, y'all. Wake up. Let's go. We can all use some milky teeth, right? Verse 13. Zebulun shall dwell by the haven of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall adjoin Sidon. So when the tribe of Zebulun came into their land, they settled somewhere in between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee. and they benefited through trade, going back and forth. And so here's Issachar. He's the next guy. He's about to hear, what his dad's about to say to him. He's sitting there and anticipating. And verse 14, Issachar is a strong donkey. Well, thanks, Dad. Truly appreciate that. A strong donkey, lying down between two burdens. He saw that rest was good and that the land was pleasant. He bowed his shoulder to bear a burden and became a band of slaves. So Issachar, when he entered the land, he was in the north. They were kind of like a very large tribe. They were the third largest tribe out of the 12 tribes, according to Numbers 26. And of course, the donkey means that they were a very strong, hard-working tribe. It didn't mean that the other way. They had fertile land, so they prospered. But the problem is that they would be subject to invading armies or robbers, constantly being attacked, and would be forced to work for others. So it was great to have this prosperity, but at the same time, it carried the burden of being a slave, because they would always be invaded in some sort. So that came to be according to Jacob. Verse 16, Dan, which means judge, was intended to be a judge to the people. And he supplied one of the most important judges, Samson. He says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heel, so that its rider shall fall backwards. So he was intended to be an influence for God as his judge for the nation of Israel. But this was the tribe, it was Dan, that introduced idolatry into the nation of Israel. In Judges chapter 18, they caused Israel to fall as a result of it, in such a way that the horse rider falls backwards because of it. And then in verse 18, as Jacob is speaking of Dan, Jacob interrupts this train of thought here, knowing that the children of Israel would be drawn into idolatry. Here he quickly speaks hope here by saying, I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. Knowing the direction of Dan and the nation of Israel, Jacob infuses hope, knowing that it won't be the end of the story at that point. And I love that. He's just like in the midst of it. He knows they're getting drawn away. They're going to fall because of this, but there's hope. Verse 19, Gad, a troop, which that's pretty much what his name means, a troop. Gad, a troop, shall tramp upon him, but he shall triumph at last. Now, I know there's a lot of these short little things being said, but they do say a lot, because this is a reference of when Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, they came into the land of Israel. They settled just outside the land of Israel. They didn't go any further into the land. But anytime an invading army attacked, these 2.5 tribes would be attacked first. It's kind of like they kind of went through them first. So this prophecy did come to pass because Gad was in constant battles, but they triumphed at last. Verse 20. Bread from Asher. Now, this is my favorite tribe. Asher meaning happy. He says, shall be rich and shall yield royal dainties. So Asher enters into a very prosperous land, had great land to produce good grain, to bake great breads and pastries. And they shall yield royal dainties, as in pastries that are fit for a king. Now, this tribe definitely would be the tribe that I'd want to park next to. There's nothing like, warm coffee and then just go to the Gad pastry and get a couple of danishes. So, verse 21, Naphtali is a deer let loose. He uses beautiful words. Now, his tribe ended up settling in the region near the Sea of Galilee. And this portion where Jesus, he did a lot of his teaching and ministry there. Just as it was mentioned in Matthew chapter 4, verse 13, that he departed to Galilee. It says, and leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled, which the prophet of Isaiah spoke in Isaiah 9, chapter 1 through 2. It says, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and upon those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. So you see this image right here that Isaiah was speaking of refers to Jesus when that light, his light, comes into Naphtali. And so this was a place, Naphtali was a place of mountainous regions. It was beautiful. He refers it as the deer let loose. That would be an ideal place for animals to just want to frolic in there. And Naphtali was also known for its love for literature, because you also see that he uses beautiful words, right? They love to learn with their beautiful words. So this was a beautiful area that Jesus chose quite a bit to do a lot of his ministry. Verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bow by a well. His branch run over the well. And Jacob speaks that Joseph will prosper again. There's that vision of overflowing over the wall. And what's interesting is that Jacob here acknowledges in this next verse the difficult time that his brothers had inflicted on him. Verse 23 says, the archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. Verse 24, but his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong. By the hands of the mighty God of Jacob, from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you. So Jacob spoke of what his brothers did against him, but that God would not let that prosper. God overruled the whole entire situation for his good. So Joseph is basically saying, you've had your difficulties and you've had your trials, and God blessed you. You found favor in his eyes and the eyes of man by God who is faithful. And he has blessed you in the past, and here's how he will bless you in the future. He says, with blessings of heaven above, which rain from above for his crops, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, of the springs from the land, blessings of the breasts and of the womb, meaning his offspring. There will be an abundance of descendants from him. Verse 26, the blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. So he bestowed on Joseph the greater blessings. Although it's not recorded in the Bible, when you look at that last verse, Jacob at some point was told by the brothers the truth, right, of what they had done to Joseph, how they threw him in a pit, how they sold him off for 20 pieces of silver, took his coat, covered it with animal blood, they shredded it. I mean, the whole deceiving lie at some point was told to Jacob. Because in the midst of this blessing, he is declaring Joseph as the prince of the brothers, who was separate from his brothers. He endured so much. I can't imagine at this point, as he's going through his sons, what the sons are thinking about what they're hearing. Because a lot of it's not going to make sense to them now. But they're hearing some pretty harsh words now. Now he comes to the youngest. Now think about Benjamin. Benjamin has been an awesome kid. We don't hear a whole lot, but we know he's a good guy. You know, Joseph loved him, so did Jacob. Verse 27, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. Like, wow, Dad. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoils. And this is what that tribe of Benjamin became, a very violent tribe, known to be fierce, cruel, like he says, ravenous. They were a militant kind of people, minus the character. King Saul, the first king of Israel, was a Benjamite. The Apostle Paul also was a Benjamite. So you can imagine when Paul was starting to inflict his, where he wanted to shut the Christians down, you saw that out of him because he had such a zeal that he would drag people out of their houses, you know, and beat them, kill them, take them to prisons. He'd do whatever he needed to do. And the Benjamites, they would cause a lot of issues, a lot of grief for Israel because of their violence. Verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father spoke to them, and he blessed them. He blessed each one according to his own blessing. Then he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite as a possession for a burial place. If you remember, Abraham bought it for 400 pieces of silver. Kind of, we were joking around going, boy, that guy just took him for all his money. But Abraham in that moment was trying to secure it because the only thing he was concerned about was burying his wife, Sarah, at this point. Verse 31, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. And when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So at the age of 147, Jacob had taken his last breath as he finished talking to his sons. And what I love is that God gave him the grace to finish all that he had to say. And then he lay down to take his last breath. And Jacob, the patriarch, what a wonderful, amazing story, a life, a journey that we've went with on him. All that he'd done, from the heel catcher, the manipulator, to being an obedient and complete in the Lord, not taking a step out of Canaan unless it was God's will. And 17 years later, after being reunited with his son Joseph, Jacob went to be with the Lord. And that's a great way to finish. There's only one other way that is greater to finish. That's the rapture. But what I see is a God who never changes, is rich in his grace. And he gives us grace every day. And what I mean from the richness of his grace is how he dealt with Judah. It was such a beautiful, beautiful thing to see that. What I love about Jacob is he spoke God's truth in love, doing the will of God until he took his very last breath. I don't know about you, but that's how I want to go. I want to keep pointing up to God all the way to my last breath. But this is the richness of God's grace that is shown to us tonight, is that he had finished his race. He had reached that point where God gave him all the grace and strength to be able to say everything that God wanted him to say to his sons. And to me, that is amazing.